There is an aircraft flying combat missions today that first took off in 1952. The men who built it are dead. The enemies it was designed to destroy no longer exist. 3 separate bombers were specifically commissioned to replace it, and all 3 are either already retired or heading for the boneyard right now. Yet, this aircraft is not only still flying, it is in the middle of a roughly $48.6 billion modernization effort that will keep it in active service until at least 2060. That aircraft is the B-52 Stratofortress, and the reason it refuses to die has nothing to do with nostalgia, budget constraints, or Pentagon bureaucracy. The dark reason the B-52 is still in service is because of what it does to an enemy before it ever drops a single bomb. And no aircraft ever built has managed to replicate that effect. Let's start with what the B-52 was supposed to be and why it should have been dead 50 years ago. When Boeing delivered the first B-52 to the United States Air Force in 1955, it had exactly one mission: fly deep into the Soviet Union carrying nuclear weapons and don't come back. It was a one-way deterrent, a flying insurance policy against World War III. Nobody designing it expected these airframes to still be operational in the 21st century. The Air Force itself projected the B-52 would last about 20 years, and by the early 1960s, it was already looking obsolete. The Soviets developed surface-to-air missiles that could reach the B-52's cruising altitude. The Air Force panicked and immediately commissioned a replacement, the supersonic B-58 Hustler, which could outrun any missile. Then came the swing-wing B-1B Lancer, designed to fly fast and low to slip under radar coverage entirely. Then came the B-2 Spirit, a flying wing so precisely shaped that it was nearly invisible to radar. Each one was faster, more advanced, and more survivable than the lumbering B-52. Each one was supposed to be the aircraft that finally sent the old buff, big ugly fat fellow as the crews called it, to the museum. Instead, the B-58 Hustler was retired after just 10 years in service. The B-1B Lancer is being phased out right now. The B-2 Spirit fleet, all 21 aircraft ever built, is so expensive to operate that the Air Force is already drawing up plans to retire it in the 2030s. Meanwhile, the B-52 keeps flying. And the reason comes down to something military planners discovered in the jungle of Vietnam and the desert of Iraq. Something they never expected to measure and couldn't figure out how to build into any other airplane. The first time the B-52 revealed its true power, it wasn't doing anything it was originally designed to do. In June 1965, B-52s flew their first Arc-Light combat missions over South Vietnam, mass bombing of jungle areas where Viet Cong forces were suspected of hiding, regrouping, and moving supplies. These were not precision strikes. The bombs fell in long, parallel tracks, turning entire grid squares of jungle into craters. Analysts back in Washington debated whether these missions were efficient use of a strategic asset. The men being bombed did not have that luxury. The B-52 flew so high, between 30,000 and 40,000 feet, that it was completely invisible and inaudible from the ground. There was no sound of an incoming aircraft, no warning whistle, no growing roar of engines. The earth simply erupted without explanation, and the destruction arrived before the sound did. Entire sections of the jungle vanished in seconds. Men who survived the initial blast described being lifted off the ground and thrown through the air without ever seeing what hit them. Those who weren't physically wounded often couldn't speak, couldn't follow orders, couldn't function. The concussive pressure alone, repeated across wave after wave of strikes, caused a kind of psychological damage that no field commander could triage or treat. A Viet Cong commander named Trong Nhu Teng, who later wrote a first-hand memoir about fighting the Americans, described B-52 strikes as undiluted psychological terror. He wrote that nothing the guerrillas had to endure compared to the stark terrorization of the B-52 bombardments. Units that survived a strike often had to be pulled from the line, not because of their casualties, but because the survivors were no longer functioning soldiers. North Vietnamese commanders began rotating units out of B-52 strike zones because of what the strikes did to unit cohesion, not manpower losses. Soldiers who had stood firm against artillery, napalm, and conventional airstrikes simply broke under the invisible, unpredictable weight of carpet bombing from 35,000 feet. The B-52 wasn't just destroying positions, it was dismantling the will to hold them. By 1972, North Vietnam had been fighting the United States for 7 years and had absorbed everything thrown at it. Their air defenses were sophisticated. Their negotiators in Paris were calculating and patient, playing a long political game and waiting for the American public to force Washington's hand. Henry Kissinger was running out of leverage. On December 18, 1972, North Vietnamese radar operators watched their screens fill with signals unlike anything they had ever seen. Over 200 B-52 bombers were inbound in massive formation waves, approaching Hanoi simultaneously. Nixon had ordered what became known as Operation Linebacker II, the most concentrated strategic bombing campaign since World War II. The plan, expressed in Nixon's own words to his senior staff, was to produce a mass shock effect in a psychological context. He wanted Hanoi shaken to its core. Over 11 days, B-52s flew 741 sorties and dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. The Air Force estimated it wiped out roughly 80% of North Vietnam's electrical power production capability. Railway lines, factories, military installations, ammunition depots, and fuel storage were obliterated across both cities. One Soviet diplomat stationed in Hanoi warned Moscow that the country risked becoming, in his words, a wasteland. American prisoners of war locked inside the Hanoi Hilton heard the bombs and felt the prison walls shake, and later described cheering so hard they wept. On December 29th, 11 days in, North Vietnam agreed to return to the peace talks in Paris. The Paris Peace Accords were signed less than a month later. Historians still debate Linebacker II's lasting strategic impact. North Vietnam did eventually conquer the South 3 years later. But what could not be debated was what the B-52 had just demonstrated about itself. It wasn't only a bomb delivery system. It was a machine that could make an enemy government decide the war was no longer worth fighting. That capability would define its value for the next 50 years in ways no one fully anticipated at the time. The Gulf War proved it again, and this time the numbers were documented in detail. When General Norman Schwarzkopf began planning Operation Desert Storm in late 1990, he specifically requested B-52 strikes against the massed Republican Guard divisions dug into fortified positions along the Kuwaiti border. Schwarzkopf had studied what B-52s had done to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong morale, and he wanted that exact effect applied to Saddam Hussein's best troops before a single American soldier crossed the line of departure. The Air Force obliged. For weeks before the ground campaign began, B-52s flew nighttime missions over Iraqi positions. The strikes could be heard and felt by Iraqi units as far as 40 kilometers away from the impact zone. The ground shook. The sky flickered on the horizon. Soldiers in bunkers had no way to know if the next wave was targeting them or the unit to their left. There was no precision to aim at, no single target to defend against. The bombs came in patterns that covered entire sectors, and the psychological mathematics were simple. If you stayed in your position, you might survive the next strike, or you might not, and there was nothing you could do to change the odds. American psychological operations teams dropped leaflets specifically naming Iraqi units that would be bombed the following day. Rather than stiffening those soldiers' resolve, the forewarning broke it. Entire units deserted overnight before a bomb ever fell near them. In one documented case, an Iraqi troop commander surrendered his men to advancing coalition forces and cited B-52 strikes as his reason. The American interrogator pointed out that his position had never actually been attacked by a B-52. The Iraqi officer replied without hesitation, "That is true, but I had seen one that had been attacked." Post-war analysis of prisoner of war interviews estimated that B-52 carpet bombing missions influenced approximately 24% of the Iraqi army to desert before the ground offensive even began. When the 100-hour ground campaign finally launched, Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the tens of thousands. They had not been outmaneuvered tactically. They had not been cut off or surrounded. Many of them simply walked toward coalition lines with their hands up, having made a calculation that no amount of loyalty to Saddam Hussein was worth enduring another week of B-52s overhead. One Air Force report described the effect of a B-52 strike on Iraqi armored vehicles attempting to reposition as, like turning on a light in a cockroach-infested apartment. The vehicles scattered in every direction. One B-52 navigator who flew Gulf War missions later described the experience from the crew's side as almost clinical. They were so high and so far from the target that there was no sound, no flame, no visible reaction at all. They dropped their weapons, turned for home, and only learned what had happened from the intelligence reports the next morning. The weapon was so removed from its own consequences that the crews sometimes found it hard to comprehend the scale of what they had done. The Iraqis on the receiving end had no such distance from it. The B-52 flew 1,741 sorties during the Gulf War without a single combat loss, delivering roughly 30% of all coalition bomb tonnage from a single aircraft type. It was the oldest aircraft in the theater, and by any conventional measure, the most technologically primitive. It was also the most feared. So why can't newer aircraft produce the same effect? This is the question that gets to the real reason the B-52 is still flying in 2026. The answer is raw payload combined with range, and the two together create a combination no other aircraft has ever matched. The B-52 carries up to 70,000 pounds of weapons. It can carry that load across 8,800 miles without refueling, and with aerial refueling, that range becomes effectively unlimited. No other aircraft in the American inventory comes close to that combination. The B-2 Spirit is stealthier, but carries roughly half the payload at a cost so extreme that each operational mission requires millions of dollars in specialized maintenance. The B-21 Raider, the Air Force's next-generation bomber now coming online, is designed to penetrate defended airspace, but it too carries less, and it is built for surgical precision, not mass effect. The Air Force has come to understand that in a major conflict, it doesn't need one aircraft to do everything. That division of labor is actually the B-52's salvation. Stealth bombers like the B-21 handle the most dangerous work, threading through air defense networks to destroy specific, high-value targets that cannot be reached any other way. Once those air defenses are degraded, the B-52 enters as what planners now call a bomb truck, a flying arsenal that stands off hundreds of miles from its target and launches wave after wave of cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions. It doesn't need to be stealthy or supersonic. It needs to carry an enormous quantity of weapons across an enormous distance, and it does that better than anything ever built. The B-52J upgrade program locked in that role officially. New Rolls-Royce F130 engines are replacing the B-52H's TF33 turbofans, engines that have been running since 1961 and whose replacement parts are now machined from scratch because Pratt & Whitney ceased production of them in the mid-1980s. Updated radar, new avionics, and expanded hardpoints will allow the B-52J to carry the next generation of hypersonic missiles, weapons that travel at speeds above Mach 5 and can reach targets over 1,000 miles away before any air defense system has time to respond. The B-52 that rolls out of this modernization program in the early 2030s will carry weapons that were science fiction when its intended replacement aircraft were already being sent to the boneyard. The final measure of this aircraft is generational. When the last B-52 came off the production line in 1962, it was expected to serve for 20 years. The men who flew it in Vietnam are in their 70s and 80s now. Their sons flew the same airframe over Iraq in 1991. And today, in some crews stationed at Barksdale and Minot Air Force bases, their grandchildren are logging flight hours in a machine built before their parents were born. Because in December 2024, B-52s took part in strikes hitting more than 75 ISIS targets inside Syria. The same aircraft that shook the walls of the Hanoi Hilton in 1972 is still dropping ordnance on active battlefields. By the time the Air Force finally retires the B-52 around 2060, the airframe will be approaching 100 years old. It will be the first jet-powered military aircraft in history to reach that milestone. Every faster bomber built to replace it will have already been scrapped. The dark reason the B-52 is still in service is that no enemy has ever found a way to stop being afraid of it. And the United States Air Force has never found a reason to take that fear away. If you want more stories about the weapons, aircraft, and decisions that shaped modern warfare, subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.